Great. Hey there, everyone. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for participating in today's session. We appreciate you joining us on this Veterans Day. And we are all here for the third session in our Understanding Real Estate Development series. And today is focusing all about tax incentives and development incentives. So as a quick background, I'll sort of set some context for these series. All of these sessions are funded by the Knight Foundation, so we're very grateful to them. And when we initially crafted these sessions, we wanted to invite D4 partners, allies, staff and board to a series of trainings to really, build some in-depth knowledge about real estate development and how citizens can engage with that process and how we can further the cause of equitable development. So everyone on this call, I think, has some stake in promoting equitable development. So we're really happy you can join us. We've deliberately kept all of these sessions a little bit more intimate, right? So we want there to be maybe a smaller group of people, but because we want them to be very interactive. So as we're going through the presentations, please feel free to raise your hand. Please feel free to put a question in the chat box. And then we're gonna stop at certain points to allow more questions and answers. And I know Francis will also be going over some of this in more detail when he goes over the ground rules. I also want to let you know that we do plan on posting these sessions online on our website. So they are being recorded. If you have any major concerns about that, please feel free to message either myself or Francis in the chat, or you can always email us after the fact. So having gone through all of that preamble, I might just start by doing some quick introductions of the D4 team. And so I'll start. My name is Sam Butler, and I am the executive director here at D4. Francis or Samantha?
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everybody. My name is Francis Grunow. I'm the director of research and education it's policy and education at D4. It involves research too. And I'm really happy to be here and welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm D4's intern. And for those of you who haven't come to one of these sessions before, I'm also tech support. So I'm going to send my number in the chat. And if you have any issues with Zoom, feel free to call.
Great. Thank you, Francis and Samantha. I got to say, like, all of these sessions would not be possible if it weren't for the hard work of Francis and Samantha. So they're the ones who have really made this possible today. Yeah, so before introducing our amazing speakers and diving into the just fun and amusing depths that I know development incentives are, I'm going to kick it off to Francis, who's going to talk a little bit about like Zoom ground rules and some tips.
Thanks, Sam. I want to just go over a couple of slides here to talk about what I'm sure many or most or even all of you are becoming very familiar with over this last year, Zoom and its adjacent platforms. Just in case you need some tips, we're asking people to keep muted unless you're talking, and we definitely want to hear from you. So just make sure you keep the sound muted when you're not talking, and make sure you turn off your mute when you are talking. Similarly, for your video feed, we'd love to see you when you're speaking or in a conversation, but feel free to turn it off if you're if you don't want to have your video feed on. Both of those buttons are usually in the bottom left of your screen. You can change or check your display name if you want to change how your name appears. you can hover over your video feed, and there are three little dots and a blue button that come up. Also under the participants list, you can change that. You can customize your view settings. On the top right, there's a button that toggles between presenter view and some other views so that you can see it in a way that suits you. And we definitely want to hear from you, as Sam mentioned, so feel free to use the raise hand or clap or other emoticons as you feel you need to. We'll be checking for chats and your hand raising for questions. And then in terms of the meeting, we are going to, sort of keep it open to however you want to express yourself. If you have a question, but one of the presenters is in the middle of making a point or getting through some slides, you can raise your hand and that'll put you in the queue, and we'll be monitoring that. Again, you can just raise your hand by clicking that icon. If you are on the telephone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And then if you need to use your keyboard for some reason on Windows, it's Alt-Y or Option-Y for Apple. So Windows is Alt-Y, Apple is Option-Y. And again, make sure to use the chat feature. That's been serving us really well in terms of keeping a track of questions as they come in. And then also, finally, as a way to keep sort of a record of who's on the call or the Zoom call, make sure that you have your name in your video feed as you want it, as I mentioned earlier, but that's a way for us to know who's on here. And if you want to announce yourself during a Q&A, it'd be great to say your name and your organization, just so others know who's on this call with us. So I think that's it from me, and I'll go back to Sam, who will talk about our presenters.
Great. Thanks, Francis. Well, I have the privilege to introduce our speakers today. We have Jennifer Canales and David Schoen. And since 2006, Jennifer has worked at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, a private nonprofit corporation established in 1978 devoted exclusively to supporting Detroit's economic development initiatives. Ms. Canales currently serves as the Director of Board Administration, where she manages the daily operations of the public economic development authorities for the city of Detroit, including the Detroit Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. Jennifer received a Master of Urban Planning from Wayne State University in 2008 and is a member of the Council of Development Finance Agencies, the Urban Land Institute, and currently serves as the Vice Chair of the Ferndale Brownfield Redevelopment Authority Board of Directors. So thank you for joining us today, Jennifer. We really appreciate it. I also want to introduce David Schoen. David is with the law firm Nixon Peabody and is chair of the firm's Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, which is, and I should mention that Nixon Peabody is headquartered in Washington, D.C. He represents diverse clients from institutional investors and mission-driven lenders to for-profit developers and nonprofit project sponsors. David serves on the board of directors of Preservation Action and on the Loan Advisory Committee of Partners for the Common Good. A native of Metro Detroit and a graduate of University of Michigan and Wayne State University, David is also a member of the Project for Public Spaces Leadership Council and is an advisor of the Urban Consulate. He formerly served on the board of directors for the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. So thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you joining us. So I know we have, you each have like amazing presentations that we want to get into, but I think it might be helpful for all of us to sort of just kind of strengthen our baseline understanding of development incentives. So for those of us who joined at our second session, we talked a lot about how development projects pencil out. And, our speakers did a fantastic job showing how in many markets in Detroit, especially, there is a gap, right? A gap in financing and what is needed to, get the project ultimately built. And so, that gap oftentimes here in the city is filled by development incentives. But even within that term development incentives, there's a whole lot of jargon and political nuance that I think it's important for citizens to understand. So David and Jennifer, I might just start off by sort of asking, like, what is a development incentive? What's the difference between an incentive, a tax credit, tax abatement? I think citizens hear these terms a lot, but maybe we don't fully appreciate the differences between them.
Shall I start?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I hope all are well today. So from my point of view, incentive covers a broad range of different types of these incentives. But for the purpose of introduction, I'm going to put tax increment financing in an incentive. So tax increment financing is a reimbursement to a project, an entity in charge of the project. And depending on the TIF legislation, it's a reimbursement for costs that are spent to level the playing field with redeveloping sites out in green fields. And I'll cover that later when I'm going over brownfield TIF. A credit is a credit, and David, jump in if you're the expert on this. I know back when we had the brownfield credit, a credit was taken against the Michigan business tax for a certain eligible investment on a project. So let's say, the project was $1 million and you got a 15% credit on that eligible investment. You were able to get a credit for that. And oftentimes developers will use that as equity into a project. And an abatement is a reduction in taxes that you are paying because the taxable value is frozen, and depending on what legislation and what abatement it is that the taxes are frozen to the pre-rehab value. And I'll cover that too later on. So they all work in different ways, but they're addressing that same issue, that market need, that financial gap filler, and trying to make development on par with, somebody going out and developing, I don't know even what's left not to develop in Michigan anymore, but on par with something like that.
I think I would maybe add a little, stepping back for a second, in these three terms, incentive, as Sam mentioned in the last session, we heard how a typical affordable housing project in the city of Detroit doesn't pay for itself. There is not enough revenue generated from the rent to pay for the cost of the development. And so that gap has to be covered by some source. And so incentives broadly could be financial, or they could even be process related, where permits or other approvals are made easier to encourage something to happen, or they can be financial in nature, as Jennifer was describing. And maybe it's worth noting, as Jennifer was contrasting the kind of redevelopment of sites or buildings in the city with greenfield new construction, the idea of an incentive as being meant to level the playing field comes in part from the fact that we already incentivize new construction in former farmlands and fields by the public paying for roads and sewers and new hospitals and new schools. But nobody thinks of it in those terms. So when a developer goes and buys a 500-acre farm in Livingston County next to a 2-lane road with no I-96 interchange, he is buying something that doesn't include in its price the value of all those things that he needs in order to build his subdivision or office park or whatever. But eventually, that developer lobbies the local government, who harnesses state and local resources or taxing authority, to build in all of that public infrastructure. But nobody calls that an incentive. They just call that development. And so all of us here are interested in leveling the playing field to make it financially feasible to redevelop both sites and buildings in the city. And so Jennifer is going to talk more about certain state programs and local programs, and my focus is going to be on one of the key drivers for rehabilitating existing buildings, which is the federal historic tax credit. And we'll get more into that in a little bit.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jennifer and David. That's really appreciate. I mean, I appreciate the comment about, you know, leveling the playing field between, you know, more historic legacy cities and built environment versus, you know, buying a farm out in Livingston County, let's say. Yeah, that's really helpful. And Jennifer, I also appreciate you parsing out, you know, some of the differences between, like, you know, what is a reimbursement versus, you know, an abatement, which is reducing a developer's like tax burden, versus a you know, a credit where sometimes, you know, there's actually like a monetary exchange in some way. So you know, I know we're going to get to questions after your presentation, Jennifer. So maybe this is a good time to just sort of like dive into some of your stuff.
All right, fantastic. If we could advance to the next slide, please. Just very, very quickly, just to give you a broad overview. So I have been at DEGC since 2006, and I started there as a brownfield intern. So brownfield program is what I largely, it's my baby. I know it very well. So I'm going to cover the brownfield program as an example of how we use tax increment financing in the city. From there, I'm going to switch to some commonly used abatements that we often see with brownfield plans, but sometimes there are developers who just choose to have the abatements. And from there, I'm going to cover the community revitalization program that is through the Michigan Strategic Fund, which is managed by the MEDC.
And Jennifer, I might also just point out for our audience that one of the reasons why we're focusing on brownfield and giving it such an emphasis today is that is a very commonly used
tool in
Detroit, right? Like, yeah.
Certainly, as Sam was saying, the brownfield program in Detroit is a very robust program. We currently have somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 approved active plans. Some are complete, some are beginning. I want to let this group know that while you hear about the very big TIF projects that happen downtown, brownfield TIF can also be used for smaller scale neighborhood type projects, and those projects are actually my sweet spot. So it's you know, it can be used for a whole host of projects. So why do we use brownfield plans in the city of Detroit? So a way to qualify a property to be in a brownfield plan is that it has to be contaminated, which is what people typically think of as brownfields. But the statute that allows brownfield redevelopment, that's actually Act 381 of 1996, also allows properties that are blighted. And those are statutorily, the criteria is written by statute, and some of the common blighted criteria are subsurface debris, which we see a lot in the city, tax reversion, you know, attractive nuisance to children, a fire hazard. I think there's like 7 of them or so. Oh, if the property's in a land bank, that can be considered blighted as well. Historic. So this is a contributing building that's in a local, state, or federal historic district. And obsolete properties. So in order to be qualified as obsolete, we have to get a confirmation from the assessor, a level 3 or level 4 assessor. And obsolete just means that the building, I mean, it's obsolete. It needs new life safety systems. It needs windows and roofs. It's just, it needs to be brought up to code, basically. And as we were saying earlier, you know, the cost of developing these properties can be much higher than greenfields. Detroit, with its manufacturing and industrial legacy, there are several places where, you know, there's just contamination in the dirt or just fill. Another common thing that we see is the subsurface debris that I was talking about earlier. You know, back in the day, there were times that they would just bulldoze whole homes into basements and cover it up. So these costs make it much higher to redevelop property. And the point to having a brownfield TIF is to help offset these costs and promote investment in the city. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're talking about TIF. So what is TIF? And I have this graphic, and I have another one to show because it's a very complicated, complicated concept, and it was for me for a long time too. So at its base, when a municipality designates a TIF area district, the property value of all the real estate within its boundaries at the time it's designated is referred to the base value. And you can see that by that dark blue baseline property value. So this is what the value of the property is. The taxes that are captured or paid on that property still inure to the taxing jurisdictions. In other words, the developer does not get those taxes. The amount for a set of years after that generates the captured appraised value, and you can see that by the lighter blue portion, can be captured to reimburse for a whole host of things depending on the TIF legislation. It can be used for infrastructure, it can be used for environmental remediation, it can be used for rehabilitation of historic buildings and assets and facilities. It can also be used for business recruitment and programs. But for the basis of a brownfield TIF, we'll get to what those costs are. I also want to mention, and you'll hear me talk about this when I get further in, is the way that the state views it is there are local taxes. So these are city and county operating taxes, and then what they call state or school taxes. And so those would be the school operating and the state education tax. And so when a TIF district is being proposed, it is the state that has to approve the capture of those school taxes. Next slide, please. Okay, so a brownfield plan is a document that allows taxes to be captured and be reimbursed to a developer for those costs that I was discussing. Those costs fall into two buckets under the brownfield legislation. If I could have the next slide, please. And so these costs fall into two buckets. There's environmental and non-environmental. So under environmental, a developer or an entity can be reimbursed for environmental testing and reporting. So this means like a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which is an assessment of the historic uses of a property. And so through that assessment, it can be determined whether or not there are recognized environmental contaminants. And if so, a phase 2 environmental assessment is conducted. And that's where the actual testing of the water or the air or the dirt is conducted to see exactly what the level of contamination of the property is. Also is reimbursable is removal and remediation of contamination, as well as any ongoing monitoring and preparation of brownfield plan and work plan documents. We work closely with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And as I was saying before, once a brownfield plan is approved, then the document gets sent to the state, which is called a work plan for approval of capture of school or state taxes. So then on the non-environmental side, there are a whole host of costs that can be used as well in a brownfield plan. So we have demolition, and this can be demolition of an entire property. What we find a lot though is with the older buildings and functionally obsolete buildings, it's interior demolition. Lead, asbestos, and mold abatement. This is really, really important, and we see this a lot in brownfield plans, particularly with older buildings for obvious reasons. And the costs for that abatement can be very high. Public infrastructure improvements. So if as part of the development, developer is putting in public infrastructure that can be used for in a brownfield plan for costs. Site preparation activities. So there is a whole host of costs that fall under this, but it's basically preparing the site for construction. So grading, any kind of temporary fencing or lighting that needs to be, put into the project so that the project can move forward can be used with TIF. But there are two infrastructure categories that can be private and be in a brownfield plan. And one of those is privately owned vertical, integrated, and underground parking structures. These cannot be parking lots. They have to be multi-level parking. Another really great one is low impact stormwater management. We're beginning to see a lot more brownfield plans coming forward with this feature, due to, as we all know, the costs with stormwater management in the city. And on the non-environmental side, we work closely with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation for the approval of the state or school tax capture through their Michigan Strategic Fund. Next slide, please. And so now we come to property tax abatements. And we have Broderick Tower off to the right. There was an Oprah on this project. So this freezes real property taxes at pre-renovation levels for up to 12 years. So what does that mean? So that means that before the renovation, there was a taxable value on the property. And once that property is redeveloped for the next 12 years, the taxes that are paid on that frozen value before the rehab. This typically doesn't include school operating or state education tax. I believe the state issues 25 statewide per year that includes school, but typically it is just frozen on local taxes. If it's combined with a brownfield TIF, it is the reduction in taxes is taken at the beginning of a project. A good point of having this is it'll often free up cash flow for a developer to be able to pay debt service early on a project. And a lot of developers find these abatements helpful with leveling the market. Next slide, please. And so another commonly used abatement that we have is called the Commercial Rehabilitation Act abatement. And so much like the Oprah, this freezes real property taxes for commercial businesses or multifamily residential projects at pre-renovation level for 10 years. So we have Orleans Landing over on the river. This included a CRA. The property has to have been used as commercial within 15 years prior to the abatement. And again, we see a lot of these. And as I said before, it assists with freeing up that cash so that developers can make debt service. Next slide, please. And so another one that we see, and we see this a lot for our manufacturing projects, is an industrial facilities exemption, or PA 198. So this provides 50 or 100% exemption of real property except for land and personal property and taxes. The 100% exemption comes if it's a rehab of a facility. So if that's the case, then the taxes are frozen at the pre-rehab level. This can be for up to 12 years. It's not always 12 years. And I want to mention as we go through this, it is always looked at what the but-for is for these incentives. Like how many years does the developer need, in order to make this project financially viable? Or how much tax increment financing reimbursement does the developer need to make this project financially viable? It's not always, 12 years, and it's not always everything that they've asked for in reimbursement. So it's always, we'll review those financials to make sure that but-for is demonstrated. And so you can see off to the right, Cardinal Health Facility, which is a brownfield plant, also has an industrial facilities tax exemption. And again, with all of these, if they're combined with a brownfield TIF, the reduction in taxes is taken at the beginning of the project. Now, next slide, please. So I have another TIF chart. So this one is put a different way. And so as you can see, the baseline, the capture that stays within the taxing jurisdictions is more of the kind of yellowish orange. You can see it goes up a little bit each year under a brownfield plan. And that's because under brownfield plans, we don't capture all of the taxes. We don't capture school debt, nor do we capture city debt. So that's why you see that level go up. And so then the bright yellow is the capture for the developer. I also want to point out that the costs in the brownfield plan are listed, but after the developer is complete with the project, they have to provide us all the documentation that these costs were spent, that they were spent by the developer, and there is a review period that occurs. And just because the costs are in the brownfield plan doesn't mean the developer automatically receives those costs. The developer has to demonstrate that they've indeed paid for those costs, and oftentimes it comes in lower. Next slide, please. So this is a tax increment financing with a brownfield and an abatement. And so this is a CRA. So you can see that for the first 10 years, there's no TIF capture, or if there is, it's very little for the developer. As I said before, this is often very attractive to developers because it helps free up cash in order to make debt service on a project, to pencil the project in and make it financially viable. And so then the capture period is reduced. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier or not, but under the Brownfield Act 381, we are only allowed to capture for up to 30 years. Most brownfield plans, I mean, it depends on the size of the project, how large it is, how big the costs are. But you know, there are a lot of brownfield plans that don't last 30. They may last 12, they may last 15. Just because they can last 30 doesn't mean they do. It really depends on the costs and how much of that increment is actually realized when the project occurs. Next slide, please. And so then the last incentive, so this is a state incentive. This is the Michigan Strategic Funds Michigan Community Revitalization Program. So prior to 2012, with brownfield plans, you could also get a brownfield plan tax credit. And so the credit was on the eligible investment. Most brownfield plans we had included this credit. It was anywhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15%, depending on the legislation. And for a while, it was even 20% for projects that were located in urban centers. When then Governor Snyder took over, he got rid of the business tax credit. So what's in its place is called the Community Revitalization Program. And so it's the same idea. It's to promote renovations and redevelopment of brownfield and historic preservation sites. It's gap financing in the form of performance-based grants, loans, or other economic assistance for eligible investments for projects in Michigan. You can see off to the right-hand side, the 7LIV project, which is the former B. Siegel, received a $1.3 million performance grant. Now this has to be based off the final eligible investment. If we could advance that to the next slide. So it may not be 1.3. And this was early in on the project that the 7LIV project received this. It is very rare that projects receive grants in excess of $1 million, if at all. And I'll get to that in a minute. So much like brownfield plans, the eligible property has to be a facility, historic resource, blighted and functionally obsolete. There are also a few other properties in there, as long as the MSF board has determined that it falls in line with their guidelines. The eligible investment, so this differs from eligible activities and tax increment financing, is basically, you know, the investment used to build the property or rehab the property. The one caveat with this pot, and it's a very important pot of money, but it is very small statewide. And I believe with COVID, it was reduced even further. I was trying to get confirmation from various cohorts of mine, and I couldn't find out exactly what it was, but I believe the pot statewide is like $20 million, which isn't a lot if you think about all the development that's been going on. It's also meant to be an incentive as a last in incentive. So a developer has to exhaust all other kind of financing that they could get. And usually it is more loans than grants. Grants are, I mean, it's got to be a really, really great project, and that need needs to be demonstrated for that.
Great. Well, thanks, Jennifer. I know before jumping into David's presentation, we wanted to pause and allow for questions, right? Because I think I have to commend you for getting a lot of information in actually a very short time, right? Because like Oprah, CRA, 198s, right?
Yeah.
Lions, Tigers, Bears. Just there's so much to cover. So, you know, for audience members, I want to encourage you to raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and we'll make sure to get those out there. I have a starting question. I'll use my prerogative to just sort of ask the first question.
Sure.
I know a lot of people have questions about the but-for analysis, right? And can you talk a little bit about like how that but-for analysis happens in Detroit? Who's making those decisions? You know, are there certain criteria that they use? You know, how are we determining what projects gets incentives and for how long?
Well, I think, you know, there are varying factors on what determines the but for based upon risk. So, you know, a hotel project downtown may not be as risky as putting a hotel, say, you know, over on the east side. So, you know, we look at developer return. We also look at the ability of the developer to pay debt service, because developers have to take out loans for these projects more often than not. And so it's very important for them to be able to make that debt service. So there is a review of financials to see if that but for qualifies, and it really depends on what type of project it is, where it's at, and the risk that goes with it. And we often allow a higher return to a developer for a riskier project versus, you know, a lower return on a project that we're pretty sure is not going to be as difficult as a riskier project is.
And I know for a brownfield to be, you know, approved, like there's decisions that get made at like the local level and the state level.
Exactly.
Are those government levels, are they each doing their own but-for analysis or, yeah, okay.
We work in tandem with, and our state partners are great, both at EGLE, so Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, formerly Department of Environmental Quality. And we work very well with the MEDC. It's a partnership with those state agencies to see this brownfield plan come together. So it's being reviewed on all sides.
Got it. And it occurred to me that I was using the perhaps jargony term, but for it, if there's anybody in our audience who doesn't know the term, the full sentence is, if not but for this incentive, the project would not be able to move forward, right? Is that the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, if it weren't for this incentive, the project wouldn't be financially viable. And so that's what needs to be demonstrated. It's not a, hey, I'm allowed to have this TIF, I'd like it. It has to be a, hey, I need this TIF or this project can't happen.
Got it.
You know, and when you think about things like contamination in the ground, you know, I mean, you know, the new owner didn't make that contamination. And to me, in my mind, it makes sense that they should be reimbursed for that cleanup.
Got it. So we have a couple questions in the chat. One of the questions is, what does the accountability for these programs look like? So, yeah, I mean, I guess that gets into like the monitoring on an ongoing basis, right? Like I'm sure there are things in place to make sure that, yeah, the money is being spent how it was supposed to.
Oh yeah. I just spend the month of August reporting on all of our brownfield plans with the state. There is a lot of monitoring that's going on. As I said earlier, there are, so we have a reimbursement agreement for brownfield plans. The reimbursement agreement spells out exactly what the developer has to do and what the Brownfield Authority has to do. I will say that for projects over $3 million, the developer has to be in compliance with the Department of CREO, so Civil Rights and Inclusion and Opportunity. They have to be in compliance with Executive Order 2016-1. But with respect to the costs themselves, the developer has to submit those costs, and we have a review. It can take up to a month to review these costs. They need to make sure that they're in the brownfield plan, that they're approved by the work plan. You know, as I said before, the developer's got to be able to demonstrate that the developer actually paid for these costs and not a third party. So there's a lot of review. And then following that, every year, I have to report on the taxes that were captured for that project. We also, since 2013, we have to report on the metrics, which I think is a really good thing. So I have to reach out to developers and ask them, you know, what was your investment and what, you know, how many people are employed and how many of them are Detroit residents. So there's a lot of back and forth to make sure that what the project was supposed to be is. With brownfield, the CRP program, as I said before, is a state program. So they have their own compliance. And I know there's a deep dive and a deep review on exactly what those costs are. and making sure that they're in line with the statute. With respect to tax abatements, and I have to be honest, I never work on the tax abatement side. I just know about them because I see them in my plan so often. I know that the city with tax abatements has agreements with the developer. And so if the developer is not in line with what they're supposed to be doing, those tax abatements can be clawed back.
And that's often Creo who is monitoring that stuff and handling the
Yeah,
clawback?
yeah. I mean, Creo's had so many iterations, and I think that they are moving on full steam these days, which is really great to see. You know, a few years ago, it was, you know, I mean, back when it was considered the Human Rights Department, you know, it was just, you know, it wasn't as robust as the department that it is now. But yeah, and it's Creo, and I believe HRD, so Housing and Revitalization Department, also has to keep track on those payments.
Got it. So, well, we have a couple questions in the chat. So clearly, this is a this is a big topic. On the question of clawbacks, I just have one more question that I want to get into, which is, so the OPRAs, the CRAs, the 198s,
Mhm.
those are approved at the state level.
They
Or
are approved at the state level only if the reduction of, actually their state tax commission has to approve them. So yes,
Okay.
but the state has to, if there's any kind of school reduction in school, then it has to have state approval as well.
Got it. But all of those three abatements that I just mentioned, they get
Mhm.
approved at a
Yeah.
local level, which is
They
partly
get
why
approved at the local level and
then
then sent to the state tax commission.
because if
That
it was a
process
purely
I'm not
state,
that familiar with, so.
fair enough.
Yeah.
Because if it was a purely state abatement, right, abatement of state taxes, then I imagine Creo would have a difficult time monitoring that, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, largely it's an abatement of local taxes.
Okay.
And it is the value of which the taxes are paid is frozen at the pre-rehab level. So while the developer may still be paying taxes at the value that the property was, and it's only on the building itself, it typically doesn't include land. So their tax is still being paid on the land as well.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. I know we had a couple questions about like the accountability measures and monitoring. We also have a question in the chat asking about, you know, which of these are reimbursements versus abatements, and I know you covered that, but I guess just to kind of like recap, the brownfield is a reimbursement.
That is correct. So the brownfield is a reimbursement for costs that an entity has incurred to correct the brownfield conditions of a site. These costs have to be incurred and demonstrated before we reimburse. I will also say that, you know, if the taxes aren't generated on the site that were projected, we are in no way required to make it up with any other sorts of funds. So the developer is aware of that as well.
But in OPRA, the CRA, and the 198, those are all just abatements.
That's an abatement. So it's certain taxes are abated. So what's abated is the increase in the value of the property due to the renovation or rehab. So that increase in that taxable value, the local taxes on that are paid only at the base value. So the delta, the upswing, that value is kept off of tabulating the taxes for a period of 10 to 12 years, depending on the abatement.
Got it. And for those keeping score at home, we haven't gotten to tax credits yet. I know that'll be a major part of David's presentation, which will start in a moment. Jennifer, we just have more questions about TIFs and brownfield TIFs.
Okay.
Someone mentioned, I've only seen brownfield TIFs deployed on multi-family development projects. Can it be used on a single family rehab or new infill construction?
We actually have a couple of brownfield. So we had, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Morgan Waterfront Estates. So that was a single family, and TIF was used for that. And so we have had them. It's just with the way the market has been. It's been. I mean, in 2006 we had several brownfield plans that were approved for a single family. or condos on the river, and then the economy tanked. And so that I'm seeing that Morgan Waterfront Estates, Tammy, I just saw a chat. So when the economy tanked, a lot of those projects went to rentals, but there are single family projects within our portfolio.
And so the reimbursement, this is something I personally don't understand about brownfield TIFs. So taxes are captured.
Mm-hmm.
Are they still being collected by a government entity that then turns around and reimburses? And is that a form of check?
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good question. So yes, taxes are captured. We work closely with the CFO's office. Taxes are captured and it's on an annual basis. The developer has to pay the taxes first, and then we receive them. It is, we manage a portfolio of all these TIFs too. And so then we receive the TIF and reimburse the developer, but only once the developer has demonstrated that the costs have been incurred, that they followed CREO if they have to, Executive Order 2016-1, and that they've done everything that they're supposed to do. In the case of remediation, we need to make sure that the site is clean. So there's a lot of checking boxes before we reimburse the developer, and it happens on an annual basis.
Got it. I appreciate that. Well, before we move on to David's presentation, does anybody else in the audience have additional questions? I know they've been streaming in, but I just want to give a pause. Does anybody have more questions for Jennifer? While you're taking a minute to think about that, I have one more question. I could just pelt you all day, Jennifer. I'm
That's
really
fine.
sorry. The MCRP, unlike the others, it sounds like that is like a kind of like a finite pool of dedicated funds. So if Detroit projects aren't using that pool, will it get used by just projects elsewhere?
Yeah, and it's not me. Some of our projects include this, but there are some staff and it's not just DHC. There are staff from various entities in the city that work and look at the pipeline and see which of these projects, because the funds are limited. And so, we can say, this project's really important. This project needs these funds to move forward. And then sometimes projects fall off. So then the money is reallocated somewhere. But this pot has been reduced. And so it's kind of trying to keep track of which project is actually going to happen so they can receive the funds, but it's statewide. So, it's not like there's a certain allocation for the city of Detroit.
Yeah. I often hear that as an argument that Detroit should give more incentives, because if we don't do it, someone else will. But
I think by and large we do. I think by and large we do. That's what I have to say about that.
And I heard the MEDC is trying to craft new evaluation criteria, I guess sort of maybe analyzing that but for analysis. Like, do you have any information on that, or should we?
I don't. I know that the MEDC and I have to say this, we do the same thing. You learn as you go through a program, and you learn on ways to implement new strategies and new policies to make run smoother, or to address issues that you hadn't thought of before. And so, I haven't seen, I believe there were some guidelines that were released last summer, but, I work so closely with them that it's a constant. So this is what's new sort of a thing. So it's hard for me to say from what point to what point, if that makes sense.
Got it. Cool. Well, I really appreciate that. I'm sure we'll probably have more questions for you, so we might just send you more questions. But I also want to make sure that we get to David's presentation. So David, perhaps this is a good time to transition into your work and in tax credits and how that all happens.
Sure, thank you, Sam. So we're going to talk about the single most valuable incentive for rehabilitating old buildings. And that is the federal historic tax credit, which is especially important for Detroit because Detroit is still a city of old buildings. And one of the things that is still a struggle is to get people at all levels, from neighborhood organizations and individuals to private developers to the policymakers in the public sector, to recognize old buildings as valuable assets rather than liabilities. And as people are probably aware of the struggle at the state fairgrounds right now, we're still dealing with that lack of understanding on even really important large buildings, but it applies as well to houses, small apartment buildings, commercial buildings across the city in every neighborhood on every major thoroughfare. And so I hope that people will come away from this presentation with some understanding of how it's possible to access dollars for rehabilitation through the federal historic tax credit. So next slide. So I was asked to give a little context for this, and my comment earlier about incentives applies here as well, because this whole idea of valuing historic buildings comes from several perspectives. There is the sort of economic value that they have as places that people want to be. When you think about attractive neighborhoods, desirable neighborhoods in Detroit, they tend to be the ones with beautiful old houses in them. And not just in Detroit, but elsewhere around Michigan, the places that people are most attracted to are full of and really defined by their old buildings. And so there is that whole economic benefit. And back in the 1960s, there was a recognition that that playing field that we talked about earlier was not level. And there was an interest in trying to level it because the fear was that we were losing our soul, in a sense, that our cultural heritage was being laid to waste by bad planning ideas, that, you know, highways ripping through neighborhoods, downtown historic buildings being demolished for parking lots. And so there was the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which was the first time that the Congress ever spoke to this issue of historic preservation. And so the bullets here, I won't read them, but you can look at them at your leisure, are taken exactly from the statute, which is still the law today. And that was really the origin of the federal government's interest in promoting historic preservation. But it took quite a number of years after this was enacted in 1966 to codify any sort of financial incentive from the federal government to encourage historic rehabilitation. Next slide. And that didn't actually happen until the 1970s. And we first got some accelerated depreciation benefit, and it wasn't really until I think 1978 that we got a tax credit, which we should, just as a baseline understanding, make sure people are clear that a tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in tax liability. So it's different from a tax deduction that you might get for, say, making a charitable contribution. This is at the bottom line, you owe this much tax. If you have a tax credit, you can reduce the amount you owe by the amount of that credit. And this idea has altered a little bit over the years. The current program really was established 1986. And before that, there was sort of a three-tier system. Today, what we have is this 20% tax credit. It did get its first significant legislative change in 2017. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we've been living with this 20% tax credit since 1986, and it's codified in the Internal Revenue Code at Section 47. And the tax credit program is administered by two different federal agencies. So anything relating to your federal income tax is governed by the Internal Revenue Service. So we're dealing with regulations that the Internal Revenue Service is responsible for. But because we're talking about historic rehabilitation, the National Park Service, which is part of the Department of the Interior, was tasked and is codified in the Code of Federal Regulations with administering all the design aspects of the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit. So each state has a Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, as the acronym goes, that works with the National Park Service to administer all the design aspects of the program. And that is assessing whether the building is eligible to earn historic tax credits, and then evaluating the proposed rehabilitation to see that it meets with what are called the Secretary's standards, and that's the Secretary of the Interior, which there's a whole sort of a litany, I guess you could say, of requirements, but architects who are familiar with the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, they sometimes call it Tax Act projects, know what works. And the State Historic Preservation Office is also a good resource in vetting your proposal. But this is really one of the reasons why having a team of experienced people, including an architect and perhaps a preservation consultant who is expert in these Secretary standards, will help you before you touch the building, assess whether it's viable, help you make good decisions about what you're planning to do, so that you don't spend a bunch of money and then find that you're not eligible because of the nature of the work that you did. But what's really crucial to understand is that the program does not require you to put back historic fabric that was lost. So for example, people will look at, imagine the two-story commercial building on Gratiot or Grand River that looks like a shell. And people would say, well, there's nothing left there. The roof is caving in, it's too far gone. Well, the answer is not necessarily. And you may still be able to qualify for a historic tax credit on a building like that. And moreover, you would not be obligated to return to its original state the interior of that building, which may have been damaged over time. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Rehabilitation Tax Credit is the most important in dollar volume federal program for historic preservation. Next slide. So to give you a sense of its scale, in its 40+ year history, more than 43,000 projects nationwide have generated over $90 billion in investment. There is actually a little bit more recent data here. I'm sorry, I don't have it. Each year, the National Park Service produces a statistical report about the program's use around the country, broken down by state. And I'll try to provide a link that we can use to give you the more recent information if you would like to know how the states stack up. And actually, it's also worth noting that Michigan has dropped out of the top states because we no longer have a state historic tax credit. The states listed here that have the highest usage of the federal program are also states that have a strong state historic tax credit. And Michigan, going back to 1999, did have a very good state historic tax credit. But as Jennifer mentioned, certain state taxes were eliminated when Governor Snyder took office, and with that went the elimination of the state historic tax credit. And so there has been an effort to restore the state historic tax credit in Michigan, as happened in Wisconsin. They made the bad choice to get rid of theirs and realized what an impact it had on all kinds of projects that the state would have preferred happen. And so Wisconsin restored theirs. Rhode Island in a budget crisis temporarily got rid of theirs. They've put it back. And now Michigan is hopefully on the brink of restoring our state tax credit so that we can see Michigan rise in the rankings of states and their usage of the federal program. Because we're basically walking away from federal incentive dollars by not having a state credit to go along with it. So another link I'll try to get to folks is regarding this Senate Bill 54 in Lansing, which apparently is moving, and we now have a governor who will sign it. So hopefully this will be the year that Michigan returns to the states that have a state historic tax credit, which will really have a big impact on the kinds of projects, particularly neighborhood projects, that get done, because that additional incentive will take projects that don't currently pencil over the top in being able to get done. And so this is a place where the role of advocates and neighborhood activists is crucial, so that your legislators in Lansing know that you're aware of this bill, Senate Bill 54, and that you want to see it proceed.
David, I'm going to interrupt just because we got a comment about whether MHPN is still advocating to bring back the credit. I assume they are.
They are, and they have sent around, in fact, just last night and this morning, email asking everyone to contact the state Senate about Senate Bill 54 to just express your support for it. And so I'd like to make sure we get that link out to people. Francis, if you check your email, you'll probably have it there as well. Yeah, the next one, please. So what types of buildings qualify for the federal historic tax credit? One way is if the individual building is what's called a certified historic structure, meaning that it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, like the Fisher Building here in this photo. But that is not the only way. Next slide. You could also be a building that's a contributing structure to a registered historic district. So like here on East Ferry, where the Inn on Ferry Street is located, those houses are part of historic district, and that's how they qualified back in 1999 when we worked on that project to be rehabilitated. And I can tell you that every dime from every source was needed to make that project work, and without tax credits, it would not have happened. Talk about your but for. Next slide. So sometimes people wonder about whether the federal historic tax credit is available for their single family house. And the answer is, if it's owner occupied, it's not. But if you own a house that you rent to someone else, then it is. The idea being that for tax purposes, it has to be a depreciable building. And so you only get to depreciate an asset if it is a business asset, meaning that you've rented it out to someone else. So your owner occupied house isn't, but the same house, if you rent it to someone else, is. These images here of a bridge or a stadium are also indicative of the idea that it has to be a building. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that the National Park Service is one of the 2 federal agencies that administer this program, and that they work closely with the State Historic Preservation Office in each state, the SHPO. And they do this in a 3-part process. So I mentioned that the first question is, does your building qualify? And that's taken care of in the application process by what's called the Part 1. And that evaluates the significance of the building, whether it qualifies, whether it's either individually listed or listable. So another thing to know is that a building may not be currently in the National Register, but if it's deemed to be eligible to be so, you can still proceed with tax credits and simultaneously pursue the National Register nomination. The Part 2 of the application process is where you document the condition of the building as you found it. So it's critical to take photographs and otherwise document the condition before any demolition work is done. So one problem that sometimes happens is people will take control of a building and start doing demo and do a bunch of work and then decide they want to pursue historic tax credits. Not impossible, but it's more difficult. And so ideally, being aware of historic tax credits before you start is going to make your process easier. And then Part 3 is after the work is complete. There was a question earlier about accountability. So in the historic tax credit program, the main way that developers are accountable to the federal government for this program is that they document the work that was actually completed. It goes to the SHPO, it goes to the National Park Service, and once they determine that what you actually built is consistent with what was approved in the Part 2, then you get a Part 3, which is the certification of completed work. Next slide. So there's a lot of jargon in this program, and I'll try to give you a few of the key terms that come up and also help you understand basically how it works. So the idea is that they didn't want people stringing together a bunch of maintenance costs and trying to claim credits on them. They wanted to encourage people to undertake a burst of activity to rehabilitate the building within a relatively short period of time. And so the way they do that is through what's called the substantial rehabilitation test. And the idea is that during a 24-month period, you have to spend on the rehab more than your adjusted basis in the building before you began the rehab. So, for example, if you buy a building, from the land bank for, $10,000, some of that $10,000 is the value of the land, and some of it is the value of the building. So you first have to apportion your land versus building, and then whatever the building is deemed worth at the time that you acquire it, you just have to spend more than that in order to pass the substantial rehabilitation test. So in many cases in Detroit, that's not an issue. Only when perhaps you're buying a very expensive building and not planning to do very much to it might it be a problem. The other aspect of this substantial rehabilitation test that's helpful is the idea of a phased rehabilitation test. So instead of the 24-month period, if, for example, you're talking about a project where you're not able to or not planning to do all of the work at once, you could imagine a phasing where we're going to do this wing or this floor, and then down the road, we're going to do the rest of it. And so the code gives you the ability to choose a 60-month window rather than a 24-month window to spend enough money to pass that substantial rehabilitation test. Again, probably not as much of an issue where the acquisition costs are very low, but it could come up. Next slide. So another piece of jargon that's helpful to know is qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs. And the idea here is that pretty much any money that you spend on hard costs within the four walls of the building will qualify. And similarly, soft costs, meaning construction period interest, the cost of your architect, other sorts of fees that relate to construction of whatever happens within the four walls of the historic building also count. What this is meant to do is make sure that the credit is earned on actually rehabilitating the historic building, but not, next slide, please. But not to include, actually, you can go one more beyond this one. Not to include the cost of acquisition of the land, of any expansion. So if you were to put a rooftop addition or some other kind of addition off the back, that would not count. If you're putting some kind of furniture, like you see on a pro forma, the FF&E, the furniture, fixture, and equipment, those kinds of things don't count. Any kind of site work doesn't count, but pretty much anything, including, for example, let's say you have mechanical equipment that sits on the top of the building, that counts too, it's attached. So this is something that in terms of your team, same way I was mentioning that having an architect and preservation consultant is really helpful, having an accountant that is familiar with historic tax credits is going to make this process of making sure the right costs are included and the wrong ones are excluded much easier. Next slide. So here's a sort of random number example of how you would calculate the credit. So all the kind of things we were just discussing, the hard costs and soft costs, all of those QREs in this example added up to a little more than $24 million. So this was a pretty sizable project. And remember, this is a 20% tax credit based on those QREs. So you take your 24 million, 20% of that in this case is about $4.8 million of federal historic tax credit. So that's a significant sum compared to the total amount that was spent. So that really gives you a sense of how important federal historic tax credits are to a particular project. Now, what often happens is that the project sponsor may not have its own appetite for so much credit. And the idea is that they want to monetize the value of that $4.8 million and bring in a tax credit investor who is there to claim that credit. And so that's where this yellow box comes in, where I'll show a structure diagram here in a minute that illustrates this idea that the investor who wants to claim the credit becomes a partner in the partnership that owns the real estate, or in a typical structure in a master tenant entity. And the idea is that under the tax code, the federal historic tax credit is not an item of property. You can't just sell it to somebody, but instead, whoever is an owner in the property is able to claim it. And so that's where this notion of partnership. So if you think of federal income tax is divided in a sense between corporate tax and partnership tax. So they're two very different regimes. And so the way that federal historic tax credits are monetized utilizes partnerships for federal income tax purposes. And you bring as a partner an investor who wants to claim the credit. They'll take a 99% interest that entitles them to that much of the credit, because federal historic credits follow allocations of profits. And so in this example, that 99% gives them, just shy of that $4.8 million of credit. And then the question is, well, what are they willing to invest in order to claim that credit? And how much they're willing to pay is dependent on a variety of factors, including the strength of the project sponsor, both their capacity and experience, but also their financial strength to give certain guarantees, construction risk, market risk, what kind of cash flow the project is expected to generate. All of that impacts the price. So in this example, kind of a mid price number for deals today at 85 cents per dollar of generated credit yields a gross equity contribution by the tax credit investor of just over $4 million in this example.
And David, if we can just pause, because I think this concept of like the investor and this syndication process is really important. If the developer did nothing with their tax credit, right? So like they have qualified rehab expenditures of 24, they get a tax credit of 4.8 million. If they did nothing, then that on their future tax bills, they would just be able to get 4.8 million off their future tax bills over a period of time.
Well, so the reason that it's so common, especially in larger projects, for the credit to be monetized this way is that depending on who the project sponsor is, they may not have the tax liability, they may not be able to use it. And there are certain limitations on the ability, say, of individuals, if that's who the project sponsor is, to use the credit. And so you're right that if they did nothing, they would potentially be able to make use of it, and they wouldn't have to do so all in 1 year. In fact, I mentioned that the big legislative change to the program came in 2017 with the big tax reform bill. And what that did was changed the program from a 1-year credit, which used to be until 2017, when you completed your rehab, you placed the project in service, that's when you would claim the credit. But as of 2017, at the end of 2017, this new law came into effect that made the credit a little bit less valuable, because now instead of claiming it all at once when you complete, it's taken over a 5-year period in each of the 5 years beginning at completion. So in your example, Sam, if somebody didn't bring in an investor and whoever the owners were going to claim the credit, they would do so 20% a year for each of the 5 years following completion.
But as you said, I mean, few owners can really take the full advantage of that $4.8 million tax credit, and, monetizing that and getting, connecting with an investor and being able to get $4 million up front just helps them complete the project. And so most owners and developers find that to be far more valuable.
That's right. And remember, Jennifer was mentioning earlier how in the context of brownfield, sometimes the incentive ends up being part of the capital stack as equity for the sponsor. And that's absolutely what this is. So that's why it's such a critical piece, because you're going to a lender and saying, I have $4 million of equity as part of my capital stack. That's critical. So imagine you're either kind of shoestring individual trying to do a rehab as a business person, to have institutional investor bringing $4 million to your project is huge. Or if you're a nonprofit and you absolutely don't have that kind of money available to invest, this is a way to bring in equity that would not otherwise be available.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And thanks for going on that little tangent with me, because I know a lot of people on this call are equally interested in the historic tax credits, but also the low-income housing tax credits, which I believe has a similar syndication process and monetization.
Yeah, maybe just a moment on the word syndication, because sometimes that hangs people up.
Please.
So the idea is that you are bringing in an investor. That's really, it's just another way of describing the process of monetizing the value of the tax credit. And it's the syndication process is where the project sponsor makes a business arrangement with an investor, usually a financial institution or some other capital markets player, but sometimes there are certain corporations, like for example, in the historic space, Sherwin-Williams, the paint company, is active in this business. And so that corporate investor comes in as an equity investor in order to claim the credit. That whole process is sometimes called syndication.
Got it. Cool. Appreciate that. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
No problem. Next slide. So I mentioned the idea that a nonprofit may be able to take advantage of the federal historic tax credit, and that has happened all over the country, including in Detroit and including right here at the corner of 35th and Michigan Avenue. The 5716 Wellness Center, which was a Southwest Solutions project that I worked on some years ago. And even though Southwest is a nonprofit, they were able to form a for-profit subsidiary, which was necessary to take advantage of the federal historic tax credits, because there is a prohibition in the law against so-called tax-exempt use property generating historic tax credits. And there are more than one way you can sort of be deemed to have tax-exempt use property, either because the owner is a nonprofit, or if you have a long tenancy or too much of the building occupied by nonprofits. I won't get into the super weeds of disqualified leases and tax-exempt use, but I want to leave you with the idea that it's one of these questions that needs to be looked at the very, very beginning. How is the building being used? How is it going to be used after the rehab, and by whom? But if you're a nonprofit project sponsor, you should not shy away from the possibility of using federal historic tax credits, because many, many nonprofits have done so and continue to successfully. I'll just mention this last bullet here about grant-funded QREs. So if you think of your capital stack, and sometimes nonprofits are trying to raise money through grants, that can be an issue, and there's ways to structure around it, but it's another thing to just be aware of. So I guess what I would say is, we've talked about how important the team is. We mentioned the architect and preservation consultant and the accountant, and this is a good one where, my role as a lawyer is really key early in the process if you're a sponsor, particularly a nonprofit sponsor, to look at these questions around tax-exempt use and make sure that it's going to work and that you plan for it accordingly. You're much better off doing that at the beginning of the project than, at the end. I'll do the next slide. So I mentioned how in 2017, the program changed from a 1-year credit to a 5-year credit, but it's always been and is still the case that there is a 5-year compliance period. So people sometimes wonder, well, does using historic tax credits permanently protect the building from being altered or demolished? And the answer is it does not. It only comes with a 5-year compliance period measured from completion of the rehab or completion of the last qualified rehabilitation expenditures. So if people are concerned about protecting a historic building, in perpetuity, the tool for that is what's called a conservation easement. And somebody asked earlier about the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. They are a reputable holder of easements for the purpose of historic preservation. So if you're interested in making sure that a building will not be demolished in the future, giving an easement for historic preservation purposes to a group like MHPN is a way to ensure that. The historic tax credit itself comes with only this limited 5-year compliance period. And that coincides with the term of investment by that bank or financial institution that wants to claim the credit. Remember, we talked about bringing them in as a partner, and somebody might ask, well, does that mean that they're going to own my building forever? And what's going to happen? The answer is no. The expectation and the deal structure is it's contemplated around this 5-year compliance period, so that once it's over, the investor will exit the transaction. But what you do during that 5 years is important. So if you're planning to rehab a building and sell it in year 2, you're going to run into some difficulty. It's not impossible to transfer a building during the compliance period, but it complicates things. And so it's something, again, to be thoughtful about, and to have your lawyer who knows what they're doing in this space really involved in that conversation. Next slide. Okay, I think maybe that's our pause. Should we ask if anyone else has a question, Sam?
Yeah, I think so. Are there any questions in the audience about tax credits, historic preservation, easements? Well, it looks like there aren't many.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Can David share just some examples? I mean, in his slideshow, there were several Detroit examples, but are there other examples of projects that you're particularly fond of that show off these tools? And I guess when the word easement came up, I was thinking about the book Cadillac as being one, but just some projects that have utilized these tools or that could utilize these tools.
You mean that have utilized historic tax credits, or that have used the easement?
Well, it was the easements particular. I was like, which one was it? I think it was the book Cadillac. Are there others?
Well, I guess it's worth mentioning that there is a little bit of a complication in using both things together. So I think the benefit of the easement for historic preservation purposes should happen after the compliance period ends in order to avoid any potential diminution in the value of the credit. We wouldn't want there to be, because the easement is an interest in property. So we talked about the idea of recapture and limitations on sale. If you give an easement during that 5-year compliance period, you're disposing of some part of the property. And so in order to kind of maximize both the tax credit and the easement, you'd want to enter into that easement after the 5-year compliance period is over.
Got it. We have a question from David Palmer, who asked, is there a matrix or worksheet that you can point to help do some of the lead research? And David Palmer, I might ask you, feel free to chime in and tell us a little bit more about what lead research means, or at least
lead research is a lot of David's presentation is predicated on the fact that you need to know what you're doing before you start investing in process. So when you're whiteboarding what the possible opportunities are for tax credits and finding other people's money to support a process, especially since we have a lot of nonprofits here, I'm thinking about the overlay of potential impact investing models from community foundations and other philanthropic sources, and how those can impact or community-based crowdfunding to support projects and selling equity in a project potentially as one of the pieces of the stack. So there's so many different convoluted and detailed opportunities to leverage other people's money that the worksheet or the app or how do you do early due diligence on what these things are without incurring incredible legal bills or investments of times with consultants?
Well, I think the first question is whether the building might be eligible for federal historic tax credits. And that is not too difficult to determine. You can look at the National Register of Historic Places to determine whether the building might be individually listed. More likely, you might be able to determine at the city level where the local historic districts are, and that those are National Register Historic Districts. So you can tell whether the building is a contributing structure to an existing district. You know, it just depends on how much legwork you want to do on your own. But I think talking to a preservation consultant early on, and there are some good ones in Detroit, is probably the right first call. And because there's kind of two sides to this. You know, first you determine whether you think your building might be eligible. And if so, then you can start looking at your capital stack and try to figure out how to fit the pieces together. And so I think probably your next call might be to the accountant to help you sort through that, or perhaps somebody like Richard Hosey. There are people that are out there that are experienced in these kinds of projects that in a consulting kind of way can be helpful. And that doesn't have to be an enormous investment of capital. It's more like setting people on the right road and keeping them out of the ditch as they pursue their own work.
The question is partially commingled with Jennifer's presentation as well. So the historic tax credits are but one of the opportunities on the buffet. You know, this is a good primer for what sections of the buffet folks should be considering. But are there worksheets or matrices that could be applied to that analysis from Jennifer's point of view as well?
I don't have any on hand, but I suppose you could create one with respect to trying to make that determination.
Sam, that might be a value add to kind of come out of this series is, you know, are there simple templates that can, you know, make the introduction to these complex topics to the various wannabe developers, actual developers, nonprofits, and others that are in the marketplace? Because David and Jennifer have contributed their time today. And if you think about their time at scale, they may end up, you know, investing tremendous amounts of time doing basic education for folks that want to, you know, participate in this space, especially if we start considering avenues for community-based crowdfunding for real estate projects and seeking impact investing capital from area foundations.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, David. You know, I mean, there are several nonprofits in Detroit that like seek to train small scale developers of color, you know, community minded developers and nonprofit developers. But to my knowledge, nobody has put together the type of like matrix or worksheet or template that you're describing. So I do think that is a worthwhile venture. Yeah. So great idea. Thanks for bringing it to the table, David. Cool. All right. Well, I wonder if we should pivot to the case studies, because I know you want to get to some case studies before we break, and then we can get to the final Q&A.
Okay, I think this is me. I wanted to highlight a brownfield project that we have that use some other incentives, including federal historic tax credits. This is a really special project for me because it is more of a neighborhood-based historic building, smaller scale. So this is called Casimira Apartments. The developer is Casimira Detroit LLC, and like David was talking about, sometimes nonprofits will form a for-profit for the purpose of credits because this is really Central Detroit Christian Community Development Corporation. This is a rehabilitation of a vacant building located at 680 Delaware. There are 44 1- and 2-bedroom units. What's really great about this project is 25% of the units are at 50 to 60% of area median income. which is 11 of those units. It ended up being a $9.8 million investment. If you could advance the slide, please. So you can see Casimira off to the right there. So the brownfield plan for this project was approved in February 2015. I want to step back a little and point out that brownfield plan approvals are usually like one of the first stop in actually, you know, seeing a project come to fruition. You see on the bottom that it was complete in 2018. So it was 3 years from brownfield plan approval to when actually the project was complete. The property qualified as a historic resource. So the building, of course, is a historic resource and is a facility. So because it was a dense neighborhood, there wasn't parking nearby. So CDC purchased a lot from DPS 1 block east of the apartment building for parking. And that property qualified as a facility. The brownfield plan approval was for $865,000, so a relatively small scale TIF for a smaller scale project. However, nonetheless, no less important than it would be to a large project. For costs that include BEA activities, due care activities, so cleanup for the parking lot, additional response activities, demolition, lead and asbestos, site preparation, and infrastructure improvements. And as I said before, it's complete in 2018. Next slide, please. And so there were additional incentives that went along with this project. So it was also approved for an OPRA. The abatement projected value is $732,000. This project received a $1 million Community Revitalization Program performance-based grant, which was really awesome. Historic tax credits and home funds through Housing Revitalization Department in order to assist in keeping those the affordable units truly affordable, you know, as opposed to 20% at 80% AMI. I'm really proud of this project. I think it's great, and I'd love to see projects like this move forward in the city. And those are my slides on Casimira. So if you have any questions.
David, did you have anything to add about Casimira?
Well, I think this is a good one to mention also because, Jennifer, this was a nonprofit sponsored project, right?
Exactly, yeah. But they formed for profit, so Casimira Detroit LLC.
So, you know, this was one where they were able to layer in a large number of different subsidy sources.
Mm-hmm.
In order to make the project work. And I guess we just wanted to emphasize for this group that, you know, there's a lot of upfront work that goes into making these kinds of capital stacks possible, but they're not beyond the reach of community-based organizations, and they're done all the time for a variety of uses, housing, but also community facilities as well. And it's also worth noting, it's funny to think how long ago it was that, you know, 1 million years ago when I was in college, I actually was investigating how nonprofit community development corporations used for-profit subsidiaries to advance their missions for neighborhood revitalization. And that was, you know, 30 years ago, so more even. And in the 30 years since then, you know, neighborhood-based development organizations around the country have really become expert at very complicated financings. But it never ceases to amaze me that if you look at the way community organizations get started and build their capacity, you know, with the support of groups like D4, there are always going to be people coming up who've never done it before, who look at it at the beginning and think, oh my God, how am I ever going to be able to do this? But people do it, and you'd be really amazed at the range of shoestring operations that have really managed to pull it off. It does take a great deal of dedication and usually some kind of a superwoman sort of person to lead the charge. But there's a lot of support out there and now a lot of experience that makes it possible to do projects like these.
I also wanted to add, David touched on this earlier when he was discussing grants versus you know, qualified investment. The same goes for the Brownfield Authority. So when there are projects that have been approved for tax increment financing, if they receive grant funding to cover some of those costs, they're not reimbursable either. That's considered double dipping. And I think that's a good point to mention too. So in this case, anything that the $1 million performance-based grant covered, we would not reimburse for.
So this is actually not as nice a picture of the building we saw earlier at the corner of Michigan Avenue and 35th Street. But it does have a very interesting history. It was built as a tobacco processing factory. There was a point when Detroit was a leader in making cigars. And I was told that this was one of 3 remaining cigar factories still standing in the city. And it's actually an Albert Kahn designed building. And what's really remarkable about its rehabilitation was how the uses are very much complementary to each other and also super focused on the building's location. I think we've lost the commercial density in so many of the avenues that traverse the city, but they remain important thoroughfares with bus service for people who don't have cars and a way for people to access services that they need. And so that was really, I think, the premise behind this 5716 wellness project, because they wanted to locate a primary healthcare facility, Madonna College classes, daycare, and a variety of social services that Southwest Solutions and its affiliates and some other partners provide in a location that people could actually get to, because a lot of the people who come to this building don't have a car. And so the fact that it's on a major thoroughfare with bus service, better than in some places, was an important factor. And also because it's proximate to, neighborhoods where some of the people that come here, live. So it's been done now for a number of years, and it's now just become part of the fabric of the city. But for a long time, this was a derelict building. And so I want to, point to it as an example of that eyesore that you see sitting somewhere should be seen as an opportunity and an asset, not something to be scraped. And it took, as Jennifer was describing in the Casimira example, every subsidy under the sun. This project included 2 different types of federal tax credits: the historic tax credit that we talked about, but another one also called New Markets tax credits, which, unlike the historic tax credit, which is as of right, meaning there's no limitation on how much of it is available, the New Markets program is a limited resource, so it's competitive. And this project was able to, because of the tremendous social impact that it had because of its uses, attract a significant amount of New Markets tax credit investment that resulted in basically favorable loan terms and some loans that were able to be forgiven. And we've now actually unwound this transaction. So all the investors have gone away, and Southwest is left with their building happily.
And if I could just add, this property was approved for and I referred to this earlier, the tax credits that used to go with brownfields. This project was part of a brownfield plan in 2007 and was approved for a brownfield tax credit in the amount of $750,000. So this is in our portfolio also. No TIF, just credit, and we were happy to see it come to fruition as well.
And this is an example. I wanted to show this in part, even though it's old, almost really because it's old as a project, because as people that do development work, we're always talking about the next thing that's coming or something that just finished or is in process. But it's, I think, helpful for people to understand that things can turn out as planned. Some things actually work, and this is one that did.
Got it. Well, I think we have about 15 minutes left, so we can open it up to questions from the audience. David, Jennifer, cannot thank you enough for the fantastic presentations. Yeah, there's lots of good information here. So for those audience members who are with us, feel free to raise your hand, put something in the chat. And I believe everyone can unmute themselves. So if you do have a question, please feel free to just jump in. And while you're thinking of your question, I'll start off by just asking, and this is maybe a question again for you, Jennifer. Can you tell us a little bit about the Michigan Strategic Fund and how that works and how those decisions get made?
Well, so the Michigan Strategic Fund is the board that approves the incentives. Their staff is the MEDC. So when there is a project, and I'm speaking to the how I know. I mean, they approve business development deals as well. I don't work on that side of things, but they're a board. And so when we have a brownfield TIF that's in excess of $1 million, or if there's a CRP ask, particularly if they're going together, they have to go together. It is the Michigan Strategic Fund that board that approves those funds. It is administered by the MEDC staff. So much kind of like how I'm a DEGC employee, but I do a lot of work with the Brownfield board.
So you just mentioned brownfields and the CRP. Are there other abatements or credits or incentives that go before the Michigan Strategic Fund?
There are business development incentives, and there are other incentives on that side. I don't work on those, so that I'm not as familiar with them as I am on the brownfield redevelopment side of things.
Got it. Makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, but I know they approve certain business development incentives as well.
Got it. Great. So I see David Palmer has his hand raised. So yeah, David.
Thanks. I'm curious if either of you have worked on any community capital raises on a debt or equity basis for unaccredited investors to invest in redevelopment projects as a part of the capital stack. And have you had any experience leveraging impact investing from institutions, philanthropy, or corporate as a part of that process as well?
Speak to that. It's funny, it's very on point that you should ask it, because it's kind of been a topic of great interest for me personally over the last couple of years. Just to give you a little context for my answer, Nixon Peabody does a lot of affordable housing work around the country. And one of my colleagues in New York, who represents affordable housing developers, started asking questions around impact investing as an additional source of capital, because it was, it's so obvious that the need for affordable housing is so much greater than the available incentives. There's got to be a way to attract other sorts of capital. And in Europe, for example, what they call social housing is sort of an accepted asset class with a lower risk profile, and is able to deliver a commensurately lower return and still attract investment. And so there seems to be now some greater interest in the US amongst institutional players for that kind of investment. But it's very much an in-process sort of discussion. There's a group out of Philadelphia that we've been working with that is trying to capture both of the things you asked about, the impact investing from an institutional perspective, but also having really from a buy-in perspective, to have neighborhood residents feel, have an ownership stake in the new development that's happening around their neighborhoods. So, it's something that I'm just now starting to engage in. I know there's been some activity in Detroit around that, but I don't know that it's gone very far. I think there have been some neighborhoods, kind of core city-ish neighborhoods, where some single-family houses have been renovated with dollars that included investments from neighbors, in relatively small amounts, so that they were able to have a stake in it. I don't know, Francis, you may have some more insight into some of those examples in Detroit.
Not off the top of my head, actually. I need to think about that. Sorry.
So I posted a link in the comments for a capital flow report that just came out of Washtenaw County talking about the blockages for institutional investors because they single-mindedly send almost every penny to Wall Street for their investments. So peeling off those portfolios for local community capital is something that the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation is being fairly aggressive about. And I know the Fisher Foundation has been talking about this pretty extensively as well. So I'm working on a research proposal with the University of Michigan Poverty Solutions and the School of Social Work to look at first-time homebuyer usage and education in the city, which I hope to see compiled into a community capital flow opportunity, because a lot of the developments that are available in the city of Detroit, especially with Proposal N passing now, we're at a key time. And are we going to have other people coming into the city to do whatever they do? Or are communities going to have a say in how their neighborhoods get redeveloped, especially concerning the large number of vacant lots, especially on the east side and in upper Southwest?
Yeah. David, I would love to, if you would reach out to me separately to talk about that more, and maybe we can be useful to each other. The group that I was thinking of, I'm just going to post a link to them, are called Century Partners in Detroit, that have done some of this. And in fact, I've been waiting to connect with them to find out more about what they actually did. But I think that, you know, their intent was to do exactly as you say and get buy-in from neighbors and give them a stake in what's happening, and hopefully, you know, some solid financial returns for whatever investment people are able to make.
I love that this conversation is happening. Yeah, because I mean, I think it's just crucial for projects in Detroit to be able to connect with community capital. And especially because here in Michigan, we have the Miles Act, which allows, you know, greater flexibility for unaccredited investors. David Schoen, what was the group in Philadelphia that you made reference to?
I have to find the name. It's escaping me at the moment,
Okay.
but I'll see if I can locate it.
And of course we can connect offline. Fantastic. Are there any other questions out there about incentives, abatements, tax credits, or community capital for that matter? Okay. Well, Jennifer and David, it looks like you have answered everyone's questions, which is quite a feat when it comes to development incentives.
Very impressive, yes.
Yeah, that is very, very impressive. You know, a note to the audience members, if you do think of a new question, feel free to send it to D4, and we promise to send it to our speakers. Yeah, and I know we want to talk about our next session, but maybe I'll give you, David Schoen, one last chance to do any particular plug you want to about the Senate bill.
Yes.
It looks like you put a lot of information in the chat, but I know this is a timely issue. So yeah, feel free to talk about that.
Well, let me just conclude the various links that I posted by noting the one you asked about in Philadelphia. They're called Urbane Development, and I sent a link to them, and particularly about their impact investing efforts from their website.
Great.
So David Palmer, I hope we can connect offline about that. But really, to everyone who's still with us, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at the information in the chat about Senate Bill 54. This would return the state historic tax credit to Michigan, which has been an ongoing effort ever since Governor Snyder did away with it. And in fact, it had passed the legislature, but the governor refused to sign it. So we've had now Governor Whitmer's commitment to sign this when it gets to her desk, and it does appear to be in a different committee in the Senate now and moving actively. So this is an opportunity for anybody who cares about neighborhood-based development and about you know, seeing all of the empty buildings that are still scattered around the city of Detroit get occupied, to contact Lansing and tell them to enact Senate Bill 54 and return the state historic tax credit to our toolbox, because we need it.
Great. Thank you, David, for that. Well, great. And I guess just as a final wrap up, I want to invite everyone on this call to our session next week. It's the final session in our 4-part series. So, you know, we at that point, we will have spent 3 sessions sort of like getting a baseline understanding of the various dynamics at play in real estate development and how it affects communities. So on November 18th, we're hoping to have a roundtable discussion with all of our speakers. We're going to bring everyone back. And it's going to be just a kind of a loose conversation talking about, how do we make development more equitable? Perhaps we should even start by asking, like, how do you define equitable development? But that's a thorny issue unto itself. But what are some of the innovative ideas that we as Detroiters, we as community members and community development practitioners should be encouraging and thinking about, in order to make just communities and better in general. So that will be November 18th. We really hope you can join us for that. Like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the D4 team. And with that, I'll just give one more thanks to Jennifer and David for their time today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I
Okay.
was glad to join. Thank you.
Same here.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday, November 18th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Francis.
Have a good day, everyone.